Welcome in this video, we are going to be looking at the situations in which certain running backs are being used in terms of point differential. If you're new to the channel, which you likely are, as this is probably the second video going up, I'm Dave Caban, a co-owner and senior fantasy analyst at a website called RotoViz, one of the industry standards in evidence-based analysis. We go through so much data, do a lot of analysis to give you a different view of fantasy football. Not only are we hoping to help you win, but help you look at the game a little bit differently through a more strategic, data-driven lens. With that out of the way, let's look at some running backs. Today we're going to be looking at three backfields with the top two backs in those backfields. The teams being Arizona, Indianapolis, and New Orleans. But what is point differential? Pretty simple concept. If the Cardinals are up 7-0, their point differential is +7. If that game moves along and they are losing 21-7, their point differential is -14. Why does that matter? Well, certain backs have profiles that lend them to being used when teams are trailing. For example, your prototypical receiving back is more likely to be used when the team needs to pass more, which would come when they are in a negative point differential. Conversely, if the team is up, they just want to keep grinding it out, eat that clock, they're probably going to rely more on their player that profiles as a pure rusher, as a grinder. Now, there's some players, those bell cow backs, the do-it-all backs, they're going to be used pretty much no matter what. And for them, point differential, game script, whatever you want to call it, just isn't as important. But with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the Arizona Cardinals. So, if we look at this graph here, Kenyon Drake is in red, Chase Edmonds in black. As you might expect, Drake getting the majority of rushing work, but while Edmonds sees a bit more of a slant towards the team trailing, it's not as wildly different as you might think. They're both being used when the team is ahead, both being used when the team is trailing. But like I said, there is a skew towards Drake being used when the team's ahead. On average, Edmonds is getting rushing attempts when the team is losing by 2 points. Drake is averaging rushing attempts when the Cardinals are winning by a point. Let's take a look at targets now. This goes in with what we would expect when the team is trailing by maybe more than a touchdown and a field goal, so maybe 11 points on. Then they are using Edmonds exclusively in the receiving game. We don't see Drake recording any work there. Drake's work really comes in more of neutral scripts, which at RotoViz we would consider being up to 7 or down to -7. We see more of his work kind of in those situations. Now for targets, they're both seeing targets on average when the team is trailing by 3 points. If we put this all together and we look at their opportunity, it's actually more in line than I was expecting when I first set out to look at this. For the most part, they're both being used when the team is trailing, both being used when it's ahead. And there is a skew towards Drake being used when they're ahead, as we've said, Edmonds when they're trailing, but it's not as disparate as I would have thought. So, 24% of Edmonds' opportunity has come when the team is trailing by 8 or more. Just 10% of his opportunity when the team is ahead by 8 or more points. For Drake, it's 20% trailing, 18% ahead, with it being trailing by 8 or more points, ahead by 8 or more points. So that gives us a look at Arizona. Another interesting backfield this year is the Indianapolis Colts backfield. You have Nyheim Hines there, a player that is a prototypical profile, I think, for a receiving back. Very athletic player. We've seen him be really shifty this year, make some explosive plays. But they also have Jonathan Taylor, who entered the season looking like one of the best running back prospects that we have seen in some years. Given his college profile, definitely looked like more of that pure rusher. Saw some receiving production from him in college, but didn't look like the type of guy that was going to really separate himself from the competition as a receiver. However, while he has started to put together some really nice runs, the most impressive thing that he's done this year is his work as a receiver, showing that he actually might be an above average receiving talent as a running back in the NFL. And when you look at the graphs that we're about to take a look at, you'll see that. So that's a really encouraging thing for Taylor as he starts to put things together as a running back. But let's start with the attempts. As you can see here, Hines does get a little bit more of the work when the team is trailing. Not quite as much work as Taylor when the team's ahead. And they're just not using Hines as much as a rusher. Now, I should mention that these graphs aren't accounting for games where both players didn't play, which could skew things. You know, if there was a game where Hines happened to be playing and Taylor didn't, and the Colts were trailing that entire game, that could skew things. But I think these graphs are okay to look at without accounting for that because we're looking across the season. So there's attempts. Let's look at targets, though. Right, you can definitely see here that Hines gets more usage in the receiving game. Having said that, though, the team hasn't been afraid to use Taylor to some extent when trailing. And they're using both players in the receiving game when they're ahead. It's fairly uniform, which I think is just another encouraging thing for Taylor. So if we put that all together and we look at the opportunity by point differential, this is also one that's not as skewed as you might have expected. You definitely see some skew to Hines when the team is trailing big. But I really think that this is one of those big positives you can look at for Jonathan Taylor. And there's reasons that the Colts are showing us you can believe in him. They're not turning away from him. Jordan Wilkins has been getting involved to some extent, but despite the struggles that Taylor has had, they're still looking his way, which is what you want to see for a back that overall is having a really solid rookie season, not living up to my personal expectations, but given that he's succeeding in something that was unexpected, starting to get to where we thought he could go as a rusher, I'm pretty encouraged. 15% of his work has come when trailing by 8 or more, 15% of his opportunity when the Colts are winning by 8 or more. So balanced profile there. Hines, 21% when trailing by 8 or more, 16% when winning by 8 or more. On average, the team is at a 0-point differential when Taylor rushes. They're losing by 2 when Hines rushes. -1 when Taylor is targeted. -2 when Hines is targeted. That's the Colts. Now let's take a look at the Saints. Big wild card here. Looking forward for the team is when does Drew Brees get back? Alvin Kamara, his work has gone down as a receiver with Hill playing quarterback for the Saints. But let's start off looking at rushing attempts. Here you can see that definitely Latavius Murray gets more of his work as the team wins by more and more points, or is winning by more and more points. There's a definite skew here. And we actually see that though Kamara gets more work in total as a rusher, there's a definite skew when the team is ahead large, where they're shifting and letting Murray handle more of the rushing attempts. In terms of targets, definitely not a lot of usage for Murray, much more in favor of Kamara. And here we can see there's a big difference. If the Saints are trailing, they're going to be using Kamara a lot more in total, but they use him a lot more as a receiver in total, but definitely when the team is down. We do see Murray get some targets when the team is ahead. If we put that all together, this is what we see. You can see that the Saints do have a skew towards Alvin Kamara in negative game scripts, Latavius Murray in positive game scripts. I think what you can look here is, or what you can take away from this, because some people in the playoffs might need to rely on Latavius Murray as a flex, given some things that could arise with COVID, given injuries to the other players on their team. Maybe they have CMC, Antonio Gibson. They need to fill in somewhere. If the Saints are heading into a game where you are expecting them to be in positive game script, you might be able to rely on Latavius Murray as a flex. 12% of Kamara's work has come when the team is trailing. Of course, the Saints don't trail as much as other teams. So when they're down by 8 or more points, 12%. For Kamara, 16% of his work when the team is ahead by 8 or more. Stark contrast here. Murray, just 3% of his opportunity comes when the Saints are down 8 or more points, 36% when the team is ahead. On average, we see the team winning by 2 points when they go with Alvin. Latavius is averaging rushing attempts when the team is ahead by 6 points. Kamara is seeing targets when the team is down on average by a point. In contrast, Murray when the Saints are up by 3. That's probably the biggest contrast that we saw of those 3 teams. Anyway, I always think that it's really interesting to look at these kind of breakdowns, and doing it graphically like this can definitely paint a picture. I was kind of surprised to see how in line the first 2 teams that we looked at were. Not to say that it was completely similar between the backs that we looked at, but a little bit surprising. So anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe, like, comment, all of that stuff. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching.